begin? Yes. Madhu, we're good to go.
Can we remove the slides before we do it?
Oh, that is
okay, no problem. We can continue. Welcome everybody to our fall extravaganza, focused on success and empathy for effective leadership. Now, Dahlia is very passionate about many things. She joined Toastmasters in 2007 when she was a fresh graduate in Kolkata, India. She rejoined Toastmasters after she came to St. John, New Brunswick, which she now calls home. She arrived in St. John in 2009 and joined the MBA program at University of New Brunswick. She is by profession an IT project manager professional, as well as a part-time lecturer at the University of New Brunswick. She also heads the project management chapter in New Brunswick. Dahlia has many interests, and one of her interests has been Toastmasters. She became a distinguished Toastmaster in 2018, and she continued speaking. She even has a TEDx speech in 2019, which she called A World Beyond Your Own. Now, Dahlia loves to travel, but as I mentioned, she has many interests, and with traveling, she has gone across the globe twice already and worked in places both in St. John and in New Brunswick, or St. John and in Kolkata. Her other interests include diversity, cross-cultural diversity and integration, as well as dancing, both classical and fusion. And her latest passion is a young family. She has a beautiful young son, and now that she has made St. John home, she will have a very happy family here in St. John. But today, her passion on leadership is what she is going to be presenting to us. And she would like all of us to become more empathetic leaders in the future. So we welcome Dahlia to the stage.
Thank you very much, Madhu, for that introduction. Fellow Toastmasters, distinguished guests, today let me start by telling you a story. Several years ago, I had joined my first place of work. This was in the IT division of a large corporation. Thankfully, I had a friend there who I knew from before, from my school days, who was working in the same organization in the accounting department. One day, I entered the elevator and saw her standing inside it, looking very frazzled. Not just frazzled, she looked shaken. Her body was literally shaking, and she looked like she was in extreme fear. I asked her, "What happened?" She took me by the shoulder and she said, "Dahlia, I'm going to see my manager and I'm about to lose my job. Just don't tell anybody." And she continued to shake. She couldn't share anymore. I said, "What happened?" She said, I just made a major mistake. I'm going to her to report it. And I'm sure she will fire me. At that point, my floor came in the elevator and I got out. But I couldn't get that conversation out of my head. So I took the stairs up to her floor just to see what might possibly happen and if there was any way I could support her. I went up to that floor and I saw her. I could see her silhouette in the window of her manager's room, and she was talking to her manager. I could see the conversation happening. I waited outside. A few minutes later, she came out that door, her face streaming with tears. At that point, I looked at her face and I didn't know what to say, but I just held her shoulder. I said nothing. She said, "Dahlia, do you know what just happened?" Do you know what she said? I said, "You can tell me." And she said, "It's okay. My manager said, it's okay. My department, my team will now just have to spend 6 entire working days rectifying this issue that I had created. She said, I had mistakenly rejected the invoices of all of the vendors coming in for the month, and my entire accounting team would have to spend the next 6 days rectifying that mistake, or another solution would have to be found. All of that, she said, we will be able to work out later with the team. But she told me that it's okay, and she will help me deal with this, and the team as a whole will deal with it. A few years later, in the same organization, there was an economic downturn, and like all organizations affected by it, this one was too. And that year, they had to announce to employees that they would have to forego their annual bonus. And several employees chose to leave that team. A few dedicated team members stayed on to help this company through those rough days. And guess who was among the people who stayed on and worked longer just to help that department sail through? You answered right. One of those team members was my friend in that department. Fast forward to a few years later. This is me. This is not me, but this is my story. I was heading to the US in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic with a 6-month-old baby. This was my first time flying, going through airports during the pandemic. I had a 6-month-old child with me who I was supposed to be in complete care of, taking complete care of. And I had no experience as a mother whatsoever, and zero experience with a pandemic. Constantly having to sanitize hands, wearing the mask constantly. My infant could barely recognize me. This was an early morning flight to Toronto, and my infant chose to scream through the flight. A 5 o'clock flight, it was all dark. The cabin was dark so that people would be able to sleep in the flight. However, my infant, who chose to scream throughout that flight, didn't let anybody sleep, I imagine. I tried everything. I rocked him back and forth in my lap. I tried to stand up and walk around with him. For a moment, he would stop. I'd tell him stories. I would sing. I would even bounce him up and down. For some moments, he would stop, and then he would start all over again. Turns out that the air pressure in the airplane wasn't quite working for this poor little guy. After some time, I just gave up. I put him in my seat on my lap and continued to bounce him while he continued to cry. I fed him a little, continued to cry. I changed his diapers. He continued to cry. At this point, I saw an elderly old lady slowly making her way toward me. She looked like she was in pain and her face looked serious. And I was sure she was going to give me an earful on how to manage children in flights, or why it was a very bad idea to travel with my infant during COVID. She came and stood in front of me. I looked at her for a second, and she said, "Lady, I just wanted to tell you, you are doing an amazing job as a mother." I was stunned. She came all the way from 3 rows up, from several rows up, to tell me that. And I said, "Thank you." At that point, I was almost in tears. I had been trying my best, and I knew I was failing. However, this lady was not coming to me to complain that she was disturbed. She came to me to show support and solidarity, and she came to encourage me. And she said, "You're doing the best you can. There's nothing else you can do in this situation. I get it. I understand. I'm a mother too." An hour or so later, the flight landed. It turns out this lady was in a lot of pain, and she had some knee issues as well. In the flight, airport belt where we are supposed to pick up our luggage, she was having some trouble identifying and dragging her luggage to her cart. Guess who was one of the first people who wanted to help her? Yes, you're right. It was me. I felt compelled. I felt a need to help her on her way as she had helped her on mine. Empathy. Empathy. I like this quote by Daniel Pink, who says empathy is about standing in somebody else's shoes, feeling with their heart, seeing with their eyes. It is hard to outsource and automate. It is very personal, it's very human, and it makes the world a better place. Empathy, I do believe, is what is making this world go around. We need ample doses of it everywhere with all of the troubles, the hurdles, the tribulations that we face in this world today, in our lives today, especially with the pandemic and troubles all around us. We need a kind smile, a helping hand, somebody to understand. Turns out this even applies in business. I teach at a business school, and I often read up about what is it that makes this business world tick? What do we do to have different people who are so different in terms of personalities, in terms of backgrounds, in terms of even the work that they do, to work together cohesively and produce results for an organization? It must not be that simple. Turns out empathy is a key factor which simplifies a lot in the workplace. What does it reduce? These things: stress, conflict, anxiety, absence, and turnover. And yes, we know there's so much stress that we deal with in our lives every single day. The pandemic has made it worse. When people are stressed, there's the possibility of conflict becomes higher. People are more anxious about what they are doing at work. Turns out there are a lot more absences. People even leave their organizations or places in places where they are more stressed and where they are not experiencing a lot of empathy, particularly from their supervisor. What it does increase, however, if empathy is present, it increases morale. People are actually in a better mood, which helps them concentrate, in turn leading to better creativity. People are at their original best. They are able to innovate, to create. That concentration leads to higher productivity. They can actually get more work done in less amount of time. It does lead to employee retention. People will stay on, as we saw in my friend's example, for the person who has been empathetic to them, for the manager who's been empathetic to them. And it also creates an environment of inclusion. Diversity and inclusion is a big part of our workforces these days. And research has shown that environments which are empathetic actually promote environments which are more diverse. They get to make use of that diversity. These outcomes, it turns out, we often talk about empathy as a soft skill, something that is a warm fuzzy, gives us a warm fuzzy feeling. We often don't consider that it translates into hard results, solid results. This is research, I've included the research paper here by Business Solver. It includes some interesting insights. 92% of team members would be more likely to stay with their company if business leaders empathized with their needs. 77% would consider working longer hours. 82% of people have said that they would leave their current job for a more empathetic work culture. It's often the reason people leave. And 87% of CEOs surveyed by Business Solver in their sample set have said that the company's financial performance is tied to empathy. They do see that correlation. But we've seen that 60% of CEOs have said they've struggled with being consistently empathetic. And we wonder, isn't this so simple? Isn't this just about putting ourselves in the other person's shoes, trying to experience what their day is going like, trying to experience what they might be going through in their life? Now, how might that feel? Why is it so hard? This is what we have to do. Walk a mile in someone's shoes. Now here, empathy differs from sympathy in the case that it is a shared experience. When we are trying to display sympathy for another person, we inherently distance ourselves from the scenario. Oh, I'm so sorry for you. I'm so sorry for what you're going through. In our head, it implies that we are not going through the same. It's not a shared experience for us. Empathy, however, enables us to feel the same feeling, to experience the same experience. Simple things can make it happen. We need to listen very carefully. Listen not just to reply, but listen to really understand. Practice that active listening. Emotionally connect to that other person. Judgment, there's no place for it in empathy. Preconceived notions about why a person might be feeling a certain way, or inherent bias about a certain culture or type of person or their scenario does not help with empathy. The whole point is to make the other person feel that you are not alone in this journey. You have other people here to support you. I'm here to support you. There are others here to support you. That is what will give them the strength that is a key factor in empathy. Of course, there are special circumstances that organizations also need to pay more attention to. Grief and loss, these are big ones. Research, again, that I had read by Forbes has said that 60% of employees have no special days off for paid days off for grief and loss. And if they do, it's only a matter of 2 to 3 working days. Facebook is an exception to that rule. Facebook has put in a policy of up to 20 paid working days for a person who has experienced a loss, an immediate loss in their family, or a situation of grief. And they have put in place flexible working hours, a flexible working plan as that person transitions back into the workforce. Facebook COO Sheryl Sandberg has said in the United States alone, grief-related losses in productivity may cost companies as much as $75 billion a year. That is big. And that is just grief-related losses in productivity. Can we imagine all of the losses in productivity that are caused due to so many different forms of stress in our lives? Research has also indicated that when we are supporting our employees to come back to the workforce after a loss, after a grief, those employees become very loyal to the organization. Productivity increases. The company actually benefits from that in the long run. Like grief, like loss, there are natural disasters like this pandemic that have been major, especially on our healthcare workers. Personal illnesses in the family. I read about a hospital in India where attendance by the medical staff and the doctors was at 3% at one point. They had COVID patients coming in. They couldn't care for their COVID patients. There was no way they could even operate. This was a private hospital, not a government-owned one, and they had to answer to their board of directors. Their financials were in bad shape. They at one point thought they had to close down altogether because people were so scared. Their staff were so scared of coming back to work due to COVID. What did they do in this situation? They put together their team, top executives. They decided to talk to their employees, openly discuss their concerns, put in place support systems to support the employees. Employees were encouraged to talk about what's bothering them. Talk about your experience today. If you had a really bad experience, talk about it to somebody today. They put in counselors who were there for the sole purpose of supporting their employees through their workday so that these concerns could be discussed, could be addressed. People were trying to support their employees. Food was being brought in specifically for their employees so that they would not have to cook at home during this really terrible time. And a few days later, the effects of that started to show. Productivity started to increase. Healthcare staff started to return to work. They were no longer as afraid. And this is a recent scenario. They were no longer as afraid to come back to work. Attendance increased. Medical support staff, their attendance increased as well, along with the doctors. In a few days, this hospital was back up and running. And in its city, it became one of the top healthcare providers for COVID, providing support to a lot more patients than they normally take in a month. They did not have to close down. In fact, their yearbook showed that they were not in a bad shape at all. This hospital recovered, quite literally, it recovered itself from COVID. key part of that was empathy. Turns out there are a few different types of it. I'll just go through them briefly. Effective empathy is when you are actually feeling in your mind and heart what the other person is feeling, and it is causing you to react. If somebody that you know is telling a very sad story that has given them a lot of pain, and if they are starting to cry while they say that, and listening to that, if you find yourself and subconsciously, if you find yourself also in tears, that's effective empathy. Somatic empathy takes it a level ahead. When you physically start to experience the same feelings that other person is experiencing. Case in point, here with Toastmasters, sometimes we empathize so much with our fellow speaker that even if we are a confident speaker, if we see our other fellow speaker shaking in anxiety, sometimes we tend to get those shaking feelings as well. That's somatic empathy. Cognitive empathy. When we're working out in our brain what it might be like to experience what the other person is experiencing. If an employee goes to their manager's room and shares the unfortunate news of their diagnosis with cancer, the manager immediately, their brain starts to work. How do I support this person and make them feel like they should not have to worry about work while going through their treatment? How can I make them feel the best supported by this organization as we work together to make a transition plan as this employee goes back and forth with their treatments? That's cognitive thinking. And compassionate empathy, this was listed as the type of emotion that immediately drives some action. When a colleague is talking about how they could not send their son, who in spite of to university because of the lack of funds, who in spite of getting really good grades in school and being a really smart kid, now doesn't quite know what they want to do, just because they know that there is a constraint with going to university due to the family's financial situation. When a person hears that and immediately offers some financial assistance, immediately offers some sort of solution so that things can be brought back into place for this young guy to attend university, that is an example of compassionate empathy, where an emotion immediately drove some action. Turns out it's easier said than done. Sometimes empathy can be hard to exhibit. And why? It's because of that difference with sympathy that we earlier talked about. Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice. Brene Brown has written about empathy. She's written quite a bit, and I've read excerpts from her books. She says, empathy is a choice. It's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. That there is opening ourselves up to that same experience and allowing ourselves to feel that shock, that loss, that trauma, whatever it is that the other person is feeling. That's just opening ourselves up to sometimes unpleasant experiences that we tend to shield ourselves from. It requires a lot of patience to be empathetic to the other person. Sometimes that's counter to what we need to achieve in our daily life. Could you please go on mute, Tindai? Thank you. Sometimes that's counter to what we need to achieve in our daily life. If we have several goals to achieve, several things on our to-do list for the day, it becomes harder for us to empathize with the other person. Take the time, slow down to actually understand what they're going through, listen. It also takes attention, and that we are lacking these days as we're running around from goal to goal. Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you. It also takes attention, especially to those nonverbal cues. People will not always tell you what they're feeling. They might give you some information, some initial information, and stop at that. It's to probe further. It's to look at those nonverbal cues. It requires a lot of attention, and attention is tight these days. We don't have so much of it. We're running around from task to task, trying to achieve everything we need to do. It involves giving people the benefit of the doubt. If somebody is cutting into our lane in traffic and we're on the rush to get to work or get to somewhere really important, what's the first thing we might experience? Oh, they had to do that now. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say, maybe they were also in an emergency. Maybe somebody needs urgent help. Maybe they were late for an urgent meeting and they need to go to this meeting in order to get a job. Perhaps it's an interview and they need the job. It may not be all these things, but it might. So we need to give them the benefit of the doubt. Empathy is easier with more exposure and less bias. The more exposed we are to how people from other cultures, other genders, other groups beyond us think, the less bias we tend to carry around. And that makes it easier to be more neutral in our approach. Take things just as they are, and it helps us with that no judgment policy. There are inherent impulses human beings use to react to different scenarios. And sometimes a quick negative reaction might break a person's day or really slow them down or hinder their career, or it might really upset them. We need to control the impulse to respond negatively. Even if somebody has given a so-called very bad idea. Suppose we are in a meeting with coworkers and somebody just blurts out an idea which may or may not work. It may not be the best idea. Instead of shooting that down and saying, no, that will never work. That's a bad idea. To pause and say, well, I understand why you're so excited by that idea. It could be really exciting, but unfortunately, we wouldn't be able to implement that due to compliance measures or some such scenario. That way, we're not dampening their spirit. We're not dampening their morale. The important one, and I guess the most difficult one here, as per research, is being consistent with all of this. And being consistent with our actions. Our actions need to line up to what we say because actions speak much louder than words. Our actions need to line up with what we say. If we are saying, you matter to me, if we are saying that in whichever way or form, we need to support that with our actions, just like Facebook supported themselves saying, you are important to us, our employees are important to us. They're supporting that with specific policies and actions that they're taking. Actions speak much louder than words, and people remember how you made them feel through your actions. Being consistent with that is key because what's worse than starting to listen, starting to take action, and then some point along the road that falls through the cracks? That makes it worse than if you hadn't listened in the first place, if you haven't tried to act in the first place. People might think we're pretending to care and not actually caring. We know it's all about applying this golden rule. What's the golden rule? Do unto others as you would have them do unto yourself. Or we often take it a notch further and we say do unto others as they would like to have done to themselves. The golden rule seems easy to follow, but it may not always be. Case in point, here's a story by a Sufi philosopher who says, there was a farmer who went to his neighbor's house one day and said, your bull ran loose last night and ate up all of my crops. And now how are you going to compensate me for this? The neighbor said, well, unfortunately, that's your responsibility. You should have protected your crops better, put a fence around them or something. What can I do? The bull is just an animal. They will run around. they might do some damage. You have to protect your crops better. To his surprise, the farmer quickly agrees to this point and proceeds to tell him what really happened. And what really happened was that it was not the farmer's crops, but the neighbor's crops, which that farmer's bull had destroyed. So it happened the other way. And now that the farmer had said, now that the neighbor had said, you need to protect your crops better, the same applied to him. Harder to digest than when we were telling the other person. We know after a certain period of time, this can get to be a lot. We're taking in the anxieties, the fears, the pressures, the depressions of the other people around us. So we need to recharge and recover from that. If we don't, we end up experiencing anger, sensory overload, physical, emotional burnouts coupled with anxiety. And there's so much of it going around today. We know it's a finite resource. We can run out. As a normal psychological response, we can't give ourselves again and again without replenishing. Sometimes it's important to start with ourselves. Why? We can't pour from an empty cup. So much of the research tells us, empathize with yourself first. Start with self-care. There is no shame in putting ourselves first. Sometimes we forget that in the whole idea of being supportive to the other person, we put ourselves and our priorities sometimes on the back burner. But that's actually to the detriment of ourselves and the people we're supporting. We can't pour from an empty cup. We need to take time for self-care, do what makes us feel fulfilled, feel happy, feel relaxed. That might be a warm bath, that might be a warm shower, that might be reading a book. Something that helps us feel relaxed, energized, rejuvenated to take on this world and all of its troubles. The next step, let's spread this out to our circle of control. Yes, that's the group that over which we have influence. Our influence group includes our family, our children, particularly we can raise them to be empathetic people. Our co-workers in our workplaces, we could strive to make empathy a priority and not just a nice to have that's spoken of sometimes. It could be in the performance review sheet. It could be a priority in the way we decide to do things. It could slowly be incorporated to be a big part of our culture. That, as we've seen, the research has already told us, that's beneficial not just for our employees, but for us as the organization. So, second step, let's influence our peer groups, our circles of influence. And finally, empathy goes beyond ourselves, our immediate circle of influence. Let's look around the world and what it's going through these days. Average temperature is increasing. So many species of wildlife are losing their lives just because of the way humanity is expanding. This goes beyond just human beings. Animals, our animal friends, our plant friends, our wildlife, they need our empathy as well. Our Earth is not doing as well as it was doing even 150 years ago. Its decline has accelerated. And we need to step in and show some empathy for our fellow species as well. This goes beyond ourselves. This goes beyond the humans that we know. It goes to humans that we don't know, and it goes even beyond. Once we can empathize with what's happening with those other species as well, we might be motivated to take some action to help the environment as well. We've all been there. We've had people who've lifted us up through that empathetic touch. I would like to invite perhaps one or two of you who could share maybe your experiences if you've had any. Has somebody made your day better or in some way made your life better? Could you perhaps share that with us? Maybe something maybe quick and easy. It doesn't even have to be huge. If you're talking, please unmute yourself because I know the host made everybody muted. Sometimes even a small cup of coffee when we're going through the rough day at work makes things better.
I've got something, Dahlia.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Sarah Wright from Keen Toastmasters. Thank you so much for your presentation and being here today. I'd like to share that I am a teacher, and at the elementary age, we have teachers that get sick, but we don't have any subs right now. Nobody wants to take these jobs, and so it makes it extremely hard on our campus when we're sick. And you're sick, you can't come to work. So we've really had to come together as a team to take on the challenge of taking care of these students when one of us is not able to come to work. And it has been hard and a huge challenge, but it has also showed us how much we care for each other and how much we don't want to pressure anybody into coming to work, even though there's so many barriers. And we want them to know that they're cared for so that when they get back, they can be fully ready and healthy and ready to get back to it because it's a hard job. So a lot of this really connected to what we're feeling right now, and I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing that experience. It's so relevant, and I can tell that it's replicated so many times in so many different groups who are going through the same across the world today. Yeah, irrespective of national boundaries, this is what we're going through every day, and it's so relevant. It's so relevant.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to share their story or just a brief incident, perhaps? I love to hear these stories.
Morning, Dahlia. It's Darren Duguay from Spotlight Toastmasters as well as True Blue.
Hi, Darren.
I'm a trauma survivor, multiple, and I see empathy being facilitated on a regular, consistent basis within the different groups I belong to. And that's particularly relevant for the month of November, as they've just declared the month of November being a month dedicated to survivors of suicide loss. Really loved your presentation, Dahlia, and thanks for sharing.
Thank you so much, Darren. That's so important. I find there's a lot of stigma associated with mental health, and that's part of what holds people back when showing empathy. And sometimes this is especially in the corporate environment, people are afraid to show their self, their true feelings, even when they're suffering. And I was reading about this, and research says part of it is the stigma associated with mental health. And thankfully, organizations are now making a conscious effort to get ahead of that, consciously trying to say that it's okay to talk about our mental health. It's as okay as it is to talk about our physical health. That should not be a holdback factor these days. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your story. I needed some empathy, and you have been a very empathetic audience. I needed some empathy this morning. This presentation lined up to a day when I'm in BC for a trip. So I'm actually in Vancouver right now, and this is early in the morning for me. And I'm normally not an early morning person, but for this topic and for this group, I was happy to wake up super early in the morning, and I was a little bit nervous. And this audience has made it so much better for me and so easy for me to participate. So thank you also for showing empathy by being a great audience today. I'd like to end with this one little thing. We know those people are around us. We've seen them. They've been there for us. They've done something big or small that has just helped us in our life, in whichever way, going forward, going through this journey of life. Let's remember them. We'll remember those people. We will pay it forward. We'll help another person get through their day, get through their life, get through their month, whatever the scenario may be. We'll pay it forward. We'll spread these smiles. And hey, smiles are needed. They're needed perhaps even more today than they ever were before. This is what makes the world go around. Empathy literally makes the world go around. And we'll keep that in mind as we go through our challenging days. They won't last. Our challenging days won't go last, just like the world won't will never stand still. And that's how we will remember to make it a better place for everybody around us. And I thank you so much for listening to my presentation and being a part of it.
Thank you so much, Dahlia. That was amazing.
Thank you so much, Dahlia. That was a wonderful presentation. So much for us to take back with us and to try and start to implement it in our daily lives. I wish you a wonderful trip in Vancouver and a safe journey back.
Thank you so much, Madhu. Thanks very much for being here. Bye.
Ditto, thank you so much.